Hello. Welcome to another episode of Squaring the Circle, where we ask the big questions about the issues that matter. I'm Randall Carlson, your host and guide. I begin to talk about tonight's theme by mentioning in my studies and presentations for a number of decades now has been on the role of great changes in Earth and human history, and how these changes may have affected not only the order and balance of nature, but how they affected ancient cultures as well. Knowledge of these processes, I would argue, ranks among the most critically important resources that humankind on Earth requires to survive into a successful and sustainable future. I would also state, without equivocation, that any effort at sustainability that does not take into account the great sweeping natural changes and catastrophes that have occurred repeatedly in the lifetime of the Earth is nothing more than vanity, and it is doomed to failure. The conclusion is becoming inescapable that humankind's efforts at building civilization on this planet have repeatedly been interrupted by natural events outside of human control. The self-appointed defenders of orthodoxy sneer at the idea of prior civilizations that may have demonstrated remarkable advancement, only to become subsequently lost to history because they succumbed to cataclysmic earth changes. But even as these sophists congratulate themselves for denouncing such heretical ideas, in reality, they are about to be left in the dust of a rapidly shifting historical paradigm that recognizes a much vaster narrative of the human presence on Earth than the standard versions of history and prehistory are willing to admit. There is a reason that the beginnings of agriculture, the domestication of animals, the dispersion of languages, and the first appearance of urban complexes all occurred roughly between 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. It is no coincidence that the phenomena of rapid cultural evolution came on the heels of one of the most intense periods of global change this planet has experienced in perhaps several million years. It would not be an exaggeration to describe what happened back then as a planetary reboot in the aftermath of a major system crash. All of these suddenly emerging cultural factors are the first indication of the system coming back online, during which the Earth was undergoing a period of repopulation in the aftermath of the catastrophic termination of the previous world system. However, with the obsession on global warming of the Earth from human activity, real threats to the global environment are systematically being overlooked. As an example, refer to the Squaring of the Circle podcasts, episodes 6 and 7, wherein I discussed the Great Tambora volcanic eruption in 1815 and the year without a summer that followed in 1816. In that episode, I made reference to the phenomena of volcanic winter, and I pointed out that it had major similarities to the so-called cosmic winter or impact winter that can result from the impact of an asteroid or comet into the Earth's biosphere. The potential for profound disruption of Earth's climatic and environmental stability by hypervelocity impact is very real, and it deserves a much higher priority than it generally receives. For the most part, humanity is blissfully ignorant of the threat posed to civilization by activity in the cosmic realm. However, despite that, evidence continues to accumulate that the extraterrestrial domain has played a far more prominent and dangerous role in both Earth and human history than heretofore realized or appreciated. While politicians and their accomplices conjure up make-believe threats to justify their ongoing seizure of power, most people have already forgotten what happened over the town of Chelyabinsk in Siberia on February 15th of the year 2013. On that day, a small asteroid, about 65 feet in diameter, entered Earth's atmosphere at a high rate of speed and exploded with the force of a 500 kiloton blast, or about 25 times more powerful than the atomic bomb blast that destroyed Hiroshima. Since the angle of approach was relatively shallow, it exploded about 18 miles up in the atmosphere. Even at that height, the powerful shock wave damaged over 7,000 buildings and caused over 1,500 injuries. But luckily, no fatalities. Had the object been somewhat larger, or had arrived at a steeper angle, penetrating lower into the atmosphere before exploding, there could have been hundreds or even thousands of people killed. Had that occurred, it is likely that the impact of the Chelyabinsk meteor on the consciousness and the priorities of humankind would likely be somewhat different right now. As it is, awareness of the significance of that cosmic wake-up call has quickly faded from popular consciousness. And yet, there is something remarkable, quite remarkable, about the timing of this cosmic intruder that needs to be addressed. On February 23, 2012, almost 1 year earlier than the Chelyabinsk meteor impact, astronomers discovered a near-Earth object, 2012 DA14, with an estimated diameter ranging from 100 to 130 feet. This object was nicknamed Duenda, or according to some pronunciations, Duende, named after a goblin-like creature that was native to Iberian, Latino, and Filipino folklore culture. Duenda, as a creature from folklore, could be mischievous and evil, or could sometimes be good, depending on whatever mood the creature was in at the time. It was said that he lived in the forests, that he occupied old houses, sometimes that he lived in the walls and would scare children. Anyways, asteroid Duenda was named after this creature from folklore. And in the graphic that you're going to see, you'll kind of see why. So asteroid Duenda is large enough that were it to collide with Earth's atmosphere, the kinetic energy released would be about 2.4 megatons. That would be powerful enough to destroy a large city completely. Astronomers had been tracking the orbit of Duenda since its discovery the previous year and realized that it was going to make an extremely close pass by Earth on February 15, 2013, which it in fact did do, coming within 17,000 miles, which brings it under the realm of satellites. But then, completely out of the blue and unexpected, as astronomers were tracking the approach of Duenda, came the Chelyabinsk meteor 12 hours before the expected arrival of Duenda. Regarding this timing, Alan Fitzsimmons of Queen's University Belfast considers that it is, quote, just a cosmic coincidence. But the coincidences don't stop there. On Tuesday evening, February 12th, 3 days before the Russian event, there was a powerful and impressive meteor explosion over central Cuba, which shook buildings and scared the heck out of the inhabitants. Several witnesses were interviewed by Cuban TV. One witness reported that on Tuesday, we left home to fish around 5 in the afternoon, and around 8, we saw a light in the heavens and then a big ball of fire, bigger than the sun. End of quote. Another witness, a woman at home at the time of the event, remarked, quote, my home shook completely. I'd never heard such a strange thing. End of quote. On Thursday evening, February 14th, the night before the Russian meteor explosion and the close passage of Duenda, two separate brilliant fireballs were witnessed by thousands of people in San Francisco and Southern California. And on that same day, another huge fireball exploded over Japan and was witnessed by hundreds, if not thousands, of people. On Sunday, the 17th, about 7:30 in the evening, hundreds of residents along the southeast coast of Florida witnessed multiple brilliant fireballs streaking across the sky. On the days surrounding the 15th of February, the heavens came alive with remarkable cosmic activity, almost as if the cosmos was intent on gaining the attention of planet Earth and her denizens here below, as if to remind us to remember what our ancestors of centuries and millennia ago knew, but has been forgotten. That what happens out there in the celestial realm can and does profoundly affect what happens here below. Had the Chelyabinsk object that burst into Earth's atmosphere that February 15th, 2013, had a diameter about 2.5 times larger, it would have been in the estimated size range of the object that exploded over Tunguska, eastern Siberia, in late June of 1908. If that had happened, the entire town would have been annihilated and most of the people killed. By now, many people have heard of the momentous Tunguska cosmic event, but very few are familiar with the astonishing details. Over the past several years, I have been surprised at the number of people I've encountered, educated people at that, who had never even heard of the Tunguska cosmic event. But looking back on the 20th century from the long perspective of history, I would dare to say that the Tunguska event could very well turn out to be one of the most, if not the most important event of the modern age, right up there with world wars, the invention of the atomic bomb, and the moon landing. At the end of this month, the astronomical and planetary geology communities will observe Asteroid Day on June 30th, in commemoration of this great cosmic encounter, which occurred on that date. The timing of the event provides us with an important clue as to the identity of the celestial intruder responsible for an explosion that was at least 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima atomic blast. Rather than 18 miles up in the atmosphere, as was the case with the Chelyabinsk meteor when it exploded, the Tunguska object was roughly 3 times the diameter of Chelyabinsk, and it detonated only 5 miles above the Earth's surface. So powerful was the shock wave generated from that explosion that over 800 square miles of old-growth taiga forest were utterly decimated when the wave front encountered the ground. An estimated 80 million huge trees were snapped off and splayed out in a radial pattern below the blast epicenter, as if they were no more substantial than new-mown hay. More than 100 square miles of forest directly below the epicenter were completely incinerated when it was engulfed in a fireball with a temperature of some 40,000 degrees Fahrenheit, almost 4 times hotter than the surface of the sun. I would like to mention that one of our original sponsors at Cosmographia, CBD from the Gods, is following us here to our new podcast, Squaring the Circle. As many of you know, I've been using their products for going on 4 years now, and having tried a number of CBD brands, CBD from the Gods seems the most effective for my needs, which is primarily as a sleep aid and as a remedy for inflammation and associated pain. I use both the oil and the salve. My wife also likes their products, especially the salve, which alleviates the pain in her hands, which is the result of working for years as an electrician. If you've been thinking about trying a CBD product and experiencing the benefits for yourself, give CBD from the Gods a try. To learn more and see their product line, check out cbdfromthegods.com. Any purchase of their products helps our efforts here at Squaring the Circle to realize our goal of making this world a better place. Thanks. We have no photographs of the event, no video footage or media coverage, and no YouTube clips as we do with the Chelyabinsk event. In fact, the Tunguska event was not even known to the outside world until 2 decades after the fact because the vicinity of the blast was so remote. What we do have is the blast site itself and the clues it has yielded up to determined scientists and investigators, and that along with the accounts of a few hundred eyewitnesses that have been interviewed over the years, and some limited but very valuable instrumental data, we can now derive some insight into what this event really entailed. These 3 sources of information together, however, have enabled the reconstruction of many details of this pivotal event, details that reveal to the perceptive and prepared mind that it is nothing less than the master key to unlocking the ancient and sacred mystery of the Holy Grail. But before we address that rather audacious claim, let's become familiar with the historical background to the remarkable Tunguska cosmic event that occurred on June 30th, 1908. The first scientifically trained eyewitness to reach the blast site was the Russian scientist Leonid Kulik, a mineralogist and the chief curator of the meteorite collection at the St. Petersburg Museum. Kulik was born in 1883, so at the time of the event in 1908, he was not quite 25 years old. His school and university studies encompassed forestry, physics, and mathematics. He participated in both the Russo-Japanese War and in World War I. After World War I, he taught mineralogy, and in 1920, he affiliated with the Mineralogy Museum at St. Petersburg, where it became his duty to study and oversee the collection of meteorites. In 1921, he received an assignment to collect meteorites that had fallen in the Soviet Union. And also about this time, he received a letter describing the experiences of the Evenki people who were camping along the Podkamennaya Tunguska River on the morning of the Great Explosion. From this vantage point, they had a ringside seat to the blast zone, from whence they witnessed the tremendous fireball and were overwhelmed by the intense heat and pressure waves accompanying the blast. About 1923, Kulik received a letter from a geologist who had interviewed a local Tungus herdsman. A translation of the letter reads, quote, 15 years ago, his brother lived on the river Shambi. One day, a terrible explosion occurred, the force of which was so great that the forest was flattened for many versts along both banks of the river Shambi. A verst, I should mention, is a little bit more than a kilometer. His brother's hut was flattened to the ground, its roof was carried away by the wind, and most of his reindeer fled in fright. The noise deafened his brother, and the shock caused him to suffer a long illness. Now, you know that must have been a pretty loud explosion if it causes somebody to lose their hearing. The Tunguska Road had previously crossed this place, but it was now abandoned because it was blocked, impassable, and moreover, the place aroused terror among the Tungusi people. End of quote. Kulik most likely had access to several newspaper accounts that appeared in the weeks following the mysterious and mighty celestial visitation. One amazing account appeared in the local newspaper Krasnoyarets, dated July 13th, 1908. And a translation of that newspaper article appeared in the book by E.L. Krinov, the book entitled Giant Meteorites. It describes the events as witnessed in a village about 140 miles south of the blast center. The village called Chelyabinsk village. And here's what the translation of the newspaper account. An extraordinary atmospheric phenomena was noticed in this region. At 7:43 a.m., a noise as of a strong wind was heard, immediately followed by a fearful crash accompanied by a subterranean shock which caused buildings to tremble. One had the impression that some huge beam or heavy stone had possibly struck the building. This was followed by two further equally forceful blows. The interval between the first and the third blows was accompanied by an extraordinary underground roar, like the sound of a number of trains passing simultaneously over the rails, and then, for 5 or 6 minutes, it was followed by a sound like artillery fire, between 50 and 60 bangs, becoming gradually fainter as the ground trembled. End of quote. Note that the phenomena is experienced as a powerful force within the Earth as much as it is experienced as an atmospheric force. The account goes on to say, quote, as eyewitnesses relate, before the first bangs were heard, a heavenly body of a fiery appearance cut across the sky from south to north, inclined to the northeast. Neither its size nor shape could be made out owing to its speed and particularly its unexpectedness. However, many people in different villages distinctly saw that when the flying object touched the horizon, a huge flame shot up that cut the sky in two. End of quote. Note especially the impression among the eyewitnesses that the flame shooting up cuts the sky in two. This account concludes with compelling imagery. Remember, this is from 140 miles away. Quote, the glow was so strong that it was reflected in rooms whose windows faced north. Apparently, the glow continued for at least a minute, since many peasants in the fields noticed it. The bangs were heard as soon as the tongue of flame disappeared, which would make sense because the sound waves are going to be moving slower than the visual. On the island opposite the village, horses began to whinny and cows to low and run wildly about. One had the impression that the earth was just about to gape open and everything would be swallowed up in the abyss. Fearful bangs resounded from somewhere, shaking the earth, and the invisibility of the source inspired a kind of superstitious terror. People were literally dumbfounded. End of quote. In a paper written by planetary scientists, fellow of the American Geophysical Union, Kevin J. Zonley, who is with the NASA Ames Research Center, he's an acknowledged expert in impact processes. He wrote in the journal Nature in 1996 regarding the Tunguska meteorite fall that, quote, perhaps the earliest widely held theory for the Tunguska explosion was that the world was about to end. End of quote. J.G. Crowther, writing in 1931 in Scientific American, just after the event came to the attention of the Western scientific world, elaborated upon the reaction of the indigenous people who were affected. Quote, many other reports referred to the devastation of the forest and the felling of the trees in uniform directions. One to the destruction of several Tungus families and one to a forest fire. The Tungus terror of the district will be understood when I report that Professor Kulik told me the occurrence had caused the evolution of a new tribal religion, They regarded the arrival of the meteorite as a visitation from the god named Agni, meaning fire, to punish the wicked. The place is believed to be accursed. End of quote. The belief that this event heralded the end of the world was widespread amongst the varied witnesses. This fact has tremendous significance when considering the meaning of the many pervasive apocalyptic traditions preserved in one form or another from around the world. We need to keep these modern reactions in mind as we consider those certain accounts from ancient times that will become the focus of our attention in upcoming episodes of Squaring the Circle. The cause of the Tunguska blast has been one of the great enduring mysteries of the 20th and now the 21st centuries. Its significance has not waned with the passage of time. On the contrary, the lessons it has to teach us about the reality of life on Earth and the cosmic ecosystem of which it and we are a part are now of the utmost importance. The story it has to tell is both incomparably grand and ominously revealing of mysteries long forgotten or concealed. To recap what we've covered so far. So remote was the Tunguska explosion that the outside world did not really learn of it until nearly 20 years later, after the first scientific expedition led by Russian scientist Leonid Kulik, who reached the site in the summer of 1927. That first journey of 1927 deserves to go down in the annals of history as one of the great scientific expeditions of modern times. Kulik had been hearing rumors and getting bits and pieces of information from various newspaper accounts, as I explained. An earlier trip through Siberia in 1921 in search of meteorites brought him into contact with a number of second-hand accounts, and by this time he had become convinced that the explosion was the result of a great meteorite fall. He was, however, only able to determine approximately the area of the blast at that time. He determined to mount an expedition to find the site of the meteorite fall, which he believed would have struck the Earth, leaving a crater. Kulik's ambition was realized in the spring of 1927, when an expedition was funded by the Russian Academy of Sciences. As noted, since at least 1921, he had been collecting every scrap of information he could find regarding the Tunguska event. He had formed a general idea of the location, but only imprecisely. Not having access to accurate maps presented the first challenge to overcome. He knew that the epicenter lay somewhere to the north of the Podkamanaya Tunguska River, and the nearest village was likely to be Vanavara, a small trading post along the river. So he set off on his quest to locate what he expected to be a crater where the meteor had crashed into the Earth. The Trans-Siberian Railway brought Kulik and an assistant to the village of Teshet, about 350 miles from the presumed area of the blast. From there, the intrepid scientists proceeded by horse-drawn sleds to the village of Kezhma, a journey of about 240 miles. After pushing on across steep, forested hills and precipitous gullies, they arrived at Vanavara at the end of March. Vanavara was the final jumping-off point before the expedition had to contend with the primeval swampy forests that lay between them and the blast site about 40 miles to the north. It should be understood that Kulik had only a brief window in which to locate the site before the melting of the snow in late spring and the melting of the upper layers of permafrost in the early summer. Once the permafrost melts, the ground becomes a near impassable bog, swarming with exceptionally vicious mosquitoes. Over snow and frozen ground, it was possible to make better time than after the spring thaw. However, they had to contend with temperatures as much as 40 degrees below zero. In Vanavara, Kulik hired a guide named Ilya Potapovich Petrov. He also attempted to interview locals and eyewitnesses to gain a more detailed picture of the event and a more accurate idea of where exactly it happened, and quickly found out that the local people were extremely reluctant to speak of it, holding the whole phenomena in superstitious dread. It had, as I related, inspired the formation of a new religion in which it was believed that the fire god Agni had descended to earth, smashing the forest and decimating animal life as punishment for the transgressions of the wicked. The peasants now believed that the region of the colossal explosion was accursed and would not venture into it. Hearing this only intensified Kulik's desire to find and scientifically document the site. On their first attempt to reach the blast zone, Kulik was forced to turn back by the heavy snow. The small party made their second attempt on April 18th with pack horses. 3 days out, they arrived at the hut of the herdsman Akshen, who joined the group, and they traded their horses for reindeer. Kulik and his assistant were suffering from lack of food and a variety of infections inflicted upon them by the vicissitudes of their journey, now approaching 10 weeks. 2 days of arduous marching brought the exhausted party to the periphery of the great destruction. For 2 more days, they pushed and hacked their way through the dead and prostrate trees. The vast scale of destruction proved to be too much for Potapovich and Akshen to handle, and they abandoned the mission in terror, forcing Kulik to return to Vanavara to hire new guards. The next attempt commenced on April 30th. At this point, it had been nearly 3 months since Kulik set out on his quest. Because of the primitive level of communication then available, Kulik was unable to get word back to his colleagues in St. Petersburg, who began to fear that he might be dead. This time, the party decided to travel by raft due to the immense difficulty they had encountered trekking through the forest. However, by late April, the rivers had become swollen with spring melt, and the brave team had to contend with intense rapids. Abandoning the rafts after traveling by river as far as possible, they once more set out on foot. On May 20th, Kulik again reached the edge of the great forest blowdown. For the next week, they pushed through the tangle of dead trees, always moving towards the center of the blast zone. Arriving at the mouth of the Chergima River, Kulik and his team set up camp, from whence they ventured out on daily treks. For 9 days, Kulik explored, finally realizing that the prostrate forest was splayed out radially from an epicenter that the guides referred to as the Southern Swamp. It was here Kulik believed that he would find his crater. What he found instead was a bizarre landscape where, in his words, the solid ground heaved outward from the spot in giant waves, like waves in water. Kulik's impressions and emotions, when first beholding the vast scene of destruction, as far as the eye could see, were recorded in his diary and are worthy of contemplation. Quoting from Kulik's diary, "I still cannot sort out my chaotic impressions of this excursion. From our observation point, no sign of forest can be seen, for everything has been devastated and burned. One has an uncanny feeling when one sees 20 to 30-inch thick giant trees snapped across like twigs and their tops hurled many meters away. The results of even a cursory examination exceeded all the tales of the eyewitnesses and my wildest expectations." So, in this episode of Squaring the Circle, we're going to examine the perceptions and impressions of people who witnessed or experienced firsthand the Tunguska cosmic event. There are numerous unresolved questions regarding this event, but what we do know is nothing short of astounding. The insights we can derive from a knowledge of the Tunguska event can peel back the veil on mysteries long forgotten or consigned to the religious fringe, and therefore ignored by science. But like geomythology, astromythology is now being recognized by serious researchers as a legitimate area of inquiry. And it is here that the Tunguska event can open the door to a deeper understanding of ancient traditions of apocalypse, eschatology, and prophecy. So with this in mind, let's take a deeper look into this event through the eyes and ears of those who experienced it firsthand. The principal inhabitants of the region of the Tunguska event are the Evenki people, formerly known as the Tungus, that is, people who spoke the Tungusic languages. The word Tungus was originally Russian and came to apply to a major river system in the region. It is probable that Tungusi or Evenki people originally emigrated from the Russian Far East in the area now known as Manchuria. Many of the following eyewitness accounts that I'm going to quote are from the work of Yevgeny Krinov, a Russian astronomer and geologist who authored the 1966 book Giant Meteorites. From the years 1926 through 1930, Krinov carried out research into the Tunguska cosmic event while working with the Meteor division of the Mineralogy Museum of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. Working under the supervision of Leonid Kulik, who we talked about in the previous episode, part 1 of this, Krinov participated in an expedition to the Tunguska site between 1929 and 1930. So for more background and context, go back and rewatch Squaring the Circle episode 10 if you need to. The quest to solve the mystery of the Tunguska cosmic event began with a letter sent to Kulik by a certain Volozhin, dated the 21st of November, 1921, as quoted in Krinov. Quote, "The Evenki people who were camping on the Podkamennaya Tunguska described how strong air pressure laid low a strip of forest and killed several reindeer belonging to one of the Evenki, Ivan Ilya Potapovich. Kulik received another letter, dated the 2nd of February, 1924, from Sobolev, a geologist with the Krasnoyarsk Museum. In this letter, Sobolev relates the account of Ilya Potapovich as told to him in 1923. This letter increased Kulik's desire to find the site. So, quoting now from this letter, 15 years ago, his brother, that is the brother of Ilya Potapovich, who was a Tungus and could speak a little Russian, lived on the river Shambay. One day, a terrible explosion occurred, the force of which was so great that the forest was flattened for many versts along both banks of the river Shambay. A verst, I will mention, is about 3,500 feet, a little bit more than a kilometer. His brother's hut was flattened to the ground, its roof was carried away by the wind, and most of his reindeer fled in fright. The noise deafened his brother, and the shock caused him to suffer a long illness. In the flattened forest, at one spot, a pit was formed from which a stream flowed into the river Shambay. The Tunguska Road had previously crossed this place, but it was now abandoned because it was blocked, impassable, and moreover, the place aroused terror among the Tungusi people." End of quote. Note the interesting detail about the forming of a pit from which a stream discharged. We'll come back to that as we go on here. Also, the psychological reaction among the Tungusi people. The sound of the explosion must indeed have been terrifying, given that it was so loud that the brother of Ilya Potapovich went deaf. The next quote is from a newspaper article by Ponomarov reporting from the village of Nizhny Ilimsk, and it was quoted again in Krinov, the book Giant Meteorites. Quote, "At 7:20 a.m., a mighty noise was heard, resolving into thundercracks. Although the sky was cloudless at the time, the noise caused houses to shake. Many inhabitants saw a fiery body like a beam shoot from south to northwest above the ground before they heard the thunder. Immediately afterwards, the bang was heard, and in the place where the fiery body had disappeared, a tongue of fire appeared, followed by smoke." End of quote. As you hear these accounts, take special note of the descriptors that are employed to describe the phenomena experienced by the eyewitnesses. The next quote is from the newspaper Krasnoyarets, dated July 13th, 1908, again reprinted in Krinov's book, Giant Meteorites. From the village Chelyabinsk, the 17th, now I will mention this was the old calendar that was in use at the time in 1908. The date of June 17th coincides to the date of June 30th in the Gregorian calendar, which actually we are now recording this on the 29th of June, so tomorrow will actually be the anniversary of this event. And we're looking at 1908 to 2008 plus another 16 years, so 116 years ago tomorrow. So tomorrow, now by the time you see this will be several days in the past, or maybe a week in the past. But June 30th is also the day that we recognize Asteroid Day, which is now a date chosen by astronomers to commemorate the Tunguska event of June 8th, 1908. So, from the village Chelyabinsk, we quote, "An extraordinary atmospheric phenomena was noticed in this region. At 7:43 a.m., a noise as a strong wind was heard, followed immediately by a fearful crash, accompanied by a subterranean shock which caused buildings to tremble. One had the impression that some huge beam or heavy stone had possibly struck the building. This was followed by two further, equally forceful blows. The interval between the first and the third blows was accompanied by an extraordinary underground roar, like the sound of a number of trains passing simultaneously over rails. And then, for 5 or 6 minutes, followed by a sound like artillery fire. Between 50 and 60 bangs, becoming gradually fainter, the ground trembled." End of quote. As eyewitnesses relate, before the first bangs were heard, a heavenly body out of a fiery appearance cut across the sky from south to north, inclined to the northeast. Neither its size nor shape could be made out owing to its speed, and particularly its unexpectedness. However, many people in different villages distinctly saw that when the flying object touched the horizon, a huge flame shot up that cut the sky in two. The glow was so strong that it was reflected in rooms whose windows faced north. Apparently, the glow continued for at least a minute, since many peasants in the fields noticed it. The bangs were heard as soon as the tongue of flame disappeared. On the island opposite the village, horses began to whinny and cows to low and run wildly about. One had the impression that the earth was just about to gape open and everything would be swallowed up in the abyss. Fearful bangs resounded from somewhere, shaking the earth, and the invisibility of the source inspired a kind of superstitious terror. people were literally dumbfounded. End of quote. As you hear these accounts, again, take special note of the descriptors, because we're going to come back to that in the next episode and talk about some of the traditions that have come down to us from previous times. And I think then you will see the correlations. One of Kulik's colleagues was given a testimony of a Chuchen of the Shenyager tribe, and it was recorded by I.M. Suslov in 1926. This account appeared in eyewitness accounts of Tunguska by N.V. Yasiliev and 3 others. Inokenti M. Suslov was with the Committee for Assistance to the Peoples of the North. In 1926, he collected accounts from Evenki witnesses. Quoting from this account, "We had a hut by the river with my brother Chekarin. We were sleeping. Suddenly we both woke up at the same time. Somebody shoved us. We heard whistling and felt a strong wind. Chekarin said, 'Can you hear all those birds flying overhead?' We were both in the hut, couldn't see what was going on outside. Suddenly I got shoved again, this time so hard I fell into the fire. I got scared. Chekarin got scared too." Now these are boys. They're not grown men. These are boys, probably barely more than children. "We started crying out for father, mother, brother, but no one answered. There was noise beyond the hut. We could hear trees falling down. Chekarin and I got out of our sleeping bags and wanted to run out, but then the thunder struck. This was the first thunder. The earth began to move and rock. The wind hit our hut and knocked it over. My body was pushed down by sticks, but my head was in the clear. Then I saw a wonder. Trees were falling. The branches were on fire. It became mighty bright. How can I say this? As if there was a second sun. My eyes were hurting. I even closed them. It was like what the Russians call lightning. And immediately there was a loud thunderclap. This was the second thunder. The morning was sunny. There were no clouds. Our sun was shining brightly as usual. And suddenly there came a second one. Chekarin and I had some difficulty getting out from under the remains of our hut. Then we saw that above, but in a different place, there was another flash, and loud thunder came. This was the third thunder strike. Wind came again, knocked us off our feet, struck the fallen trees. We looked at the fallen trees, watched the treetops get snapped off, watched the fires." End of quote. So here's another account. This is from Vasily Akshen of the Evenki people, and this one is also to I.M. Suslov, who collected this account in 1926. He woke up at the moment when the tent was torn away, and he was thrown aside by a powerful jolt, but did not lose consciousness. The ground shook, and incredibly loud, prolonged roaring was heard. Everything round about was shrouded in smoke and fog from the burning, falling trees. Eventually the roar died away, the wind dropped, but the forest went on burning. All 3 set off in search of the reindeer, which, at the time of the catastrophe, had rushed away. Many of them did not come back and could not be traced. End of quote. The next one is from the account of the children of Ivanak Padya, who camped on the river Avarkita. Quote begins, "They were awakened by a loud rumble. Explosions were heard everywhere. The earth trembled and there was a loud cracking noise. A terrible storm, during which they could hardly keep on their feet, flattened the forest near their tent. Far away towards the north, a kind of cloud was visible." End of quote. The next one was from the testimony of a man named Semenov. It was given to Krinov in the year 1930. Quote, I don't remember the year exactly, but more than 20 years ago, when the fallow land was being plowed up, I was sitting on the porch of the house at the trading station at Vanavara at breakfast time and looking towards the north. I had just raised my axe to hoop a cask when suddenly in the north, the sky was split in two, and high above the forest, the whole northern part of the sky appeared to be covered with fire. At that moment, I felt great heat as if my shirt had caught fire. I wanted to pull off my shirt and throw it away, but at that moment, there was a bang in the sky and a mighty crash was heard. I was thrown to the ground about 3 sageans away from the porch, this would be about 20 feet, and for a moment I lost consciousness. My wife ran out and carried me into the hut. The crash was followed by noise like stones falling from the sky or guns firing. The earth trembled, and when I lay on the ground, I covered my head because I was afraid that stones might hit it. At the moment when the sky opened, a hot wind as from a cannon blew past the huts from the north. So a sageen is about 7 English feet. Now, I will say that the town that he was in, Vanavara, is about 40 miles from the epicenter of the blast. And this is from the testimony of the daughter of Semenov, Kosolapova. Kosolapova was the daughter's name. Quote begins, I was 19, and when the meteorite fell, I was at the trading station of Vanavara. Marfa and I, Marfa's her friend, and I had come to the spring for water. Marfa began to draw water, and I was standing beside her facing north. Suddenly, before me, I saw the sky in the north open to the ground and fire pour out. We were terrified, but the sky closed again, and immediately afterwards, bangs like gunshots were heard. We thought that stones were falling from the sky and rushed off in terror, leaving our pail by the spring. I ran with my head down and covered because I was afraid that stones might fall on it. When we reached the house, we saw my father, Semenov, lying unconscious near the barn opposite the porch of the house. Marfa and I carried him into the hut. We were terribly frightened at the time. The fire was brighter than the sun. During the bangs, the earth and the huts trembled greatly. The noises at first were very loud and seemed to be right above our heads, and then they became quieter and quieter. End of quote. One of the earliest reports of the Tunguska event in Western media came in 1931 and appeared in the journal Scientific American. It had the title, More About the Great Siberian Meteor, authored by J.G. Crowther. And I quote from that article. Many other reports referred to the devastation of the forest and the felling of trees in uniform directions. I will mention here, this is before now any Western scientists have gotten to the region for themselves. So they're hearing the reports and the accounts coming from the eyewitnesses and the investigators, and they are now reporting on this in Scientific American. So many of the other reports referred to the devastation of the forest and the felling of the trees in uniform directions. One to the destruction of several Tungus families, and one to a forest fire. The Tungus terror of the district will be understood when I report that Professor Kulik told me the occurrence had caused the evolution of a new tribal religion. They regarded the arrival of the meteorite as a visitation from a god named Agdi, meaning fire, to punish the wicked. The place of the fall is believed to be accursed. The title of the article, more about the next quote is from the article entitled More About the Great Siberian Meteor. Then from letters to Kulik, which he received in 1935, 1936. Now this is after He's made several expeditions to the site. There was a certain individual by the name of Naumenko, who was from the village of Kezhma, who sent this letter to Kulik with this account. Quote, "It was about 8 a.m. on the 17th or 18th of June, 1908. The day was unusually clear, and not a single cloud was to be seen. No wind stirred, and there was absolute silence." I'll interject for a minute here that when we get into some of these accounts of catastrophic events, they're often preceded by silence, total silence, which is a very interesting phenomena. And I'm not going to get into that here now, but we will be looking at other accounts where the same observation is made. Suddenly, far off, still hardly audible, was heard the sound of thunder. It made us look up involuntarily in every direction. The sound seemed to come from beyond the river Angara and became louder very rapidly. There was something extraordinary about it. The first fairly faint crash resounded, but when I turned quickly in the direction of the crash, I saw that the sun's rays were crossed by a broad, fiery white band on the right side of its rays. On the left side, towards the north, an irregularly shaped, brilliant white, somewhat elongated mass was flying into the Taiga, with a diameter far greater than the moon. Approximately 2 to 3 seconds, maybe more, after the first faint crash, a second, louder crash of thunder resounded, as loud as that generally heard during a storm. After the second crash, the ball was no longer visible, but its tail, or rather the streamer, was now completely on the left side of the sun's rays. Then, after a shorter interval of time than that between the first and second crashes, the third thunder crash occurred. This was so loud, as though there were several crashes all mingled together within it, that the whole ground trembled. An echo, like a continuous deafening roar, resounded through the Taiga. Indeed, it seemed through the whole Taiga of vast Siberia. The carpenters, after the first and second crashes, had crossed themselves in stupefaction, and when the third crash resounded, they fell backwards from the building that they had been working on to the chips of wood. Some of them were so stunned and utterly terrified that I had to calm them down and reassure them. We all abandoned work and went into the village. There, whole crowds of local inhabitants were gathered in the streets in terror, talking about the phenomena. I would like to mention that one of our original sponsors at Cosmographia, CBD from the Gods, is following us here to our new podcast, Squaring the Circle. As many of you know, I've been using their products for going on 4 years now, and having tried a number of CBD brands, CBD from the Gods seems the most effective for my needs, which is primarily as a sleep aid and as a remedy for inflammation and associated pain. I use both the oil and the salve. My wife also likes their products, especially the salve, which alleviates the pain in her hands, which is the result of working for years as an electrician. If you've been thinking about trying a CBD product and experiencing the benefits for yourself, give CBD from the Gods a try. To learn more and see their product line, check out cbdfromthegods.com. Any purchase of their products helps our efforts here at Squaring the Circle to realize our goal of making this world a better place. Thanks. The next account is from one Kokarin, who was sailing down the river Angara, not far from the village of Bogashani. Quote, "In the north, a pale bluish light glowed, and from the south, a fiery body that was considerably larger than the sun and left a broad, bright streamer behind it, flew across the sky. Then such a cannonade broke out that all the workmen who were in the boat rushed to hide in the cabin, forgetting all about the danger that threatened from the rapids. The first bangs were faint, but became progressively louder. The sound effect, he estimated, lasted 3 to 5 minutes. The intensity of the sounds was so great that the boatmen were completely demoralized. The next account is from one individual by the name of Vakulin, the postmaster of the Nizhny Ilimsk village. Quote, about 8 a.m. on Tuesday, 17th of June, a large group of local inhabitants say they first noticed a ball of fire in the northwest, coming down obliquely to the horizon from east to west. When it approached the ground, it changed into a pillar of fire. After its disappearance, a cloud of smoke was seen rising upwards from the ground. A few minutes later, a loud noise was heard, with separate, deafening crashes like peals of thunder. These crashes were followed by 8 loud bangs like gunshots. The final bang was exceptionally loud and accompanied by a whistling noise. End of quote. The next one is from an account by Kukulin, an agriculturist, in a letter to the director of the Irkutsk Observatory. Quote, the crash was heard along the Lena River from near Verkholensk to Mukati, over a distance of about 1,300 versts. Remember, a verst is a little bit more than a kilometer, so that's going to be hundreds of miles, probably 700 to 800 miles. Eyewitnesses said that where the body fell, a pillar of black smoke rose up. The Tungus people wandering beyond the hamlet of Nizhny Karalinsk said that the thunder was terrible. So verst is 3,500 feet, so 1,300 versts would be about 860 miles. The next one is from the account of the peasant Romanov, and it begins. At the beginning of the 9th hour in the morning, local time, a ball of fire appeared in the sky and moved from southeast to northwest. As the ball approached the ground, it first took on a flattened out shape from top to bottom, and just before it struck the ground, it had the appearance of 2 pillars of fire. When this fiery mass fell to the ground, 2 loud crashes like thunder were heard, and then a noise like a strong wind was heard. End of quote. The next is from the account of Kulesh, director of the Kerensky Meteorological Station, in a letter dated June 23, 1908. It begins. On the 17th of June, in the northwest of Kerensky, an extraordinary phenomenon was observed. At 7:15 a.m. in the northwest, a pillar of fire appeared in the shape of a spear. When the pillar disappeared, 5 loud, sharp bangs, as from a cannon, following swiftly and distinctly one after the other, were heard. Then a dense cloud appeared in that spot. End of quote. The interesting correlation to me there is the image of the spear. The next one is from an account of an individual, Obruchev, who was a geologist traveling near Vanavara in 1924, and it appeared in the magazine Mirovenania. And excuse me, because I do not speak, I'm not a native Russian speaker, so I'm probably horribly mangling some of these names and words. But anyways, the account begins. The area of flattened forest is about 4 days' journey from the mouth of the Shambe by birch bark boat. That is over 100 kilometers, which is about 60 miles. In winter, it is 3 days' journey by reindeer in a direct line about 50 to 60 kilometers. The shape of the area on the plan is distorted, but from questions answered, it would appear to be circular. The forest was completely flattened on the northeast. The Evanok, Ilya Potapovich, who was living at the time at the trading station at Teturia, 25 kilometers to the southwest of Vanavara, told me that at the spot where the meteorite fell, a pit was formed from which a stream flowed to the river Shambay. Ilya Potapovich's brother was living in this region at the time of the fall when his tent flew up into the air like a bird. Some of his reindeer were killed by falling trees, and he himself was deprived of speech for several years. Again, note the interesting that a pit appears and then a stream of water begins issuing from the pit. The next account is from Krinov. It was the account of Sarachev. I am a tanner, and in the summer, about 8 a.m., I was washing wool on the bank of the river Kan. Suddenly, a noise like the fluttering of the wings of a frightened bird was heard, coming from a southeasterly direction, and a kind of swell came up the river. After this came a single sharp bang so loud that one of the workmen, Vaslav, fell into the water. This was followed by several dull bangs like subterranean rumbling. At the first explosion, a kind of radiant body appeared in the air. It was roundish, about half the size of the moon, tinged with blue, and flew swiftly from Filimenovo to Irkutsk. It left a trail behind it in the form of a pale blue band that stretched over its whole path. End of quote. The next account is from Golashkin, from the village of Kamenskoye on the river Yenisei, 600 kilometers west-southwest of the place of the fall. It was reported in a letter of June 30th, 1908, that at 7 a.m. in the village of Kamenskoye, the following phenomena were observed. 3 subterranean thunder crashes sounded from the northwest, one after the other. Some inhabitants felt the ground and buildings shake. From questioning the local inhabitants, he learned that several minutes earlier, some of them had seen an elongated body narrowing towards one end and more than an arshine in length, torn as it were from the sun. Torn as it were from the sun. This is an important detail. Its head was as bright as the sun, but the remainder was duller. The body flew across the sky and fell in the northeast. End of quote. The next one is the report of the Evenki Ilya Potapovich about the stream. Before we go on, that this report of the Evenek Ilya Potapovich about the stream deserves mention. A stream, Chergima, actually flows from the place of the fall. This stream is of very ancient origin, as may be judged from its deeply carved-out bed in the cliffs, and at one point it has formed a great waterfall. One theory is that when the meteorite fell, a stream was formed as the result of the liberation of subterranean waters that had been under pressure. There is another possible assumption, namely that the ancient stream Chergima mentioned above did not exist when the meteorite fell, but its dried-up riverbed had been preserved. When the meteorite fell and opened up underground water, the old stream bed was again filled with water and a new stream was formed. End of quote. The next account says, on the first night after the fall of the Tunguska meteor, from June 30th to July 1st, 1908, and with lesser intensity on a few successive nights, extraordinary optical phenomena were observed in the Earth's atmosphere. Everywhere in western Siberia and over all Europe, the attention of scientists and of a large number of people was primarily attracted by the unusually bright nights. In fact, it may be said that from the 30th of June to the 1st of July, there was no night at all. At the same time, massive glowing silvery clouds were seen against a background of brilliant, colorful sunsets. Now, after hearing these accounts, it's interesting to refer to some of earlier traditions, and I'll just do a couple of examples here that would suggest maybe some of these traditions, in this case I'm going to quote a Bible verse, may be considered within the context of what we've just heard. And this is from the Psalms 18th chapter, verses 12 through 15. And the Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the highest gave his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. Yet he sent out his arrows and scattered them, and he shot out lightnings and discomfited them. Then the channels of waters were seen, and the foundations of the world were discovered at thy rebuke, O Lord, at the blast of the breath of thy nostrils. And remember, the Tunguska people say, the thunder was terrible. Now consider this verse from the 2nd chapter of the book Acts, 2nd chapter, 2nd verse. And suddenly there came a sound from heaven as of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled the house where they were sitting. And there appeared unto them cloven tongues like as of fire, and it sat upon each of them. Now there are many more examples of from ancient traditions. I just grabbed those two to give you a sample of them. In Part 3 of this, The Cosmos Speaks, we're going to take a deeper dive into some of those ancient traditions, but now looking at those through the lens of what we have learned about the Tunguska event of 1908, and why I call this The Cosmos Speaks and look at it as, in effect, cosmic lessons. Now, this is from a more recent account. Kevin Zonley, an astronomer who wrote in the scientific journal Nature back in 1996, he contributed an article entitled "Leaving No Stone Unturned." And he says, quote, "Perhaps the earliest widely held theory for the Tunguska explosion was that the world was about to end." End of quote. Then he goes on to say that the Tunguska impactor exploded above a sparsely inhabited region in central Siberia with the force of a 15-megaton bomb. The blast wave flattened trees over 2,000 square kilometers and excited a magnitude 5 earthquake. Thermal radiation scorched trees and set fires over much of the range. And even 70 kilometers away, an observer removed his shirt for fear it would ignite. The earliest scientific expeditions to the impact site, launched almost 2 decades after the event, concentrated on the search for meteorites. But no meteorite was found. Instead, the explorers found a huge region of trees felled in a striking radial pattern, at the center of which they found standing trees stripped of branches. Apparently, the meteor exploded in the air. Recent attention has focused on whether the Tunguska body was a comet or an asteroid. At present, there are 2 reports of possible debris. One is a modest iridium excess in local peat. Now, you may recall that iridium was the first clue found at the Cretaceous-Tertiary boundary from 66 million years ago, when the dinosaurs were exterminated, that the possible cause of this extinction may have been an extraterrestrial impact, because iridium is a very common metal that's found in asteroids. It's one of the so-called platinum group metals, and it's a siderophile, meaning that it likes to bond to iron, and because iron is dense, when the Earth was forming, the iridium bonded with the heavy iron sank into the mantle and took the iridium with it. So there is a deficiency of iridium in the Earth's crust, but there's an excessive amount of iridium in asteroids and even in comets. So one of the findings, the two reports of possible degree, one was a modest iridium excess that was found in local peat bogs, and the other a relatively high abundance of microscopic dust particles in tree resins exposed between 1902 and 1920 in local conifers that survived the explosion. These may prove to be extraterrestrial, but neither is likely to determine the type of impactor. And that's the end of the quote from the 1996 article. Now, the next quote is from I.S. Astapovich. It was published in 1934 in the Quarterly Journal of the Royal Meteorological Society. The title of the article is Airwaves Caused by the Fall of the Meteorite on 30th of June 1908 in central Siberia. So it begins, quote, "The flight and fall of the meteorite on the 30th of June 1908, amongst the greatest meteoric phenomena known to mankind, must occupy one of the foremost places because of the magnitude of the phenomena accompanying its movement through the atmosphere. It is unlikely that our generation may again be witnesses of a similar meteoric phenomena." Now here's an interesting point that Astapovich makes. If it had occurred 4 hours and 47 minutes later, when the city of Leningrad would have lain on the same parallel near the center of the explosion, our knowledge of it would probably have been considerably more extensive. And in fact, if it had completely wiped out Leningrad, which it would have done, the history of the 20th century may have been very different. Okay, the next quote is from Fred Whipple. Came in 1930. It was, I think this was the first Western account of the event. It was published in the Quarterly Journal of the Royal Meteorological Society, and the title of the article by Fred Whipple was "The Great Siberian Meteor and the Waves, Seismic and Aerial, which it produced." And I quote from Whipple's article, "There are many marvelous features in the story of the Siberian meteor, a story without parallel in historic times. It is most remarkable that such an event should occur in our generation, and yet be so nearly ignored. No civilized man sought out the falling place of the meteor for 20 years, and even now no one has followed up the track of the pioneer. This paper has been devoted to incidental effects, and it is therefore appropriate to emphasize two coincidences. Seismographs were in readiness to demonstrate that Earth waves can be produced by the impact of a meteor with the ground. Now let me intersect there. At this point in 1930, scientists were not aware of the fact that the object had not actually struck the ground. So in some ways this is even more remarkable, because if we were going to update this comment, it would read, seismographs were in readiness to demonstrate that Earth waves can be produced by the impact of a meteor with the atmosphere. Which to me is very interesting. If you think back to the accounts, many of them are referring to subterranean effects, or the sense that great trains are passing beneath their feet under the ground, like multiple trains, freight trains at one time passing over the rails. So it seems like there was definitely a subterranean component to this. And we're going to explore this a little further in depth in the next episode. So I hope you come back for that. Anyways, going on with Whipple's quote here, he says, Microbarographs. First of all, get this. So seismographs were in readiness to demonstrate that Earth waves can be produced. Secondly, microbarographs. Now, a barograph measures changes in atmospheric pressure. Microbarographs had been invented just in time to preserve records of the air waves generated in the atmosphere. Now, these microbarographs, bear in mind, they're in England at the time, in 1908. Again, we're going to talk about that in more detail in the next episode. But going on with Whipple, if the meteor had fallen even 5 years earlier, there would have been no evidence for the spreading of the airwaves beyond the immediate locality of the fall. If it had fallen 20 years earlier, we should have known nothing of the Earth waves. We're going to wrap this episode up with a quote from the great Isaac Asimov that appeared as an introduction to the book The Fire Came By John Baxter and Thomas Atkins that was published in the year 1976. So Isaac Asimov contributed the introduction to the book. And this is what he has to say. Once, and only once, in known history, was there a clear and documented event that looked as though a large meteorite had fallen on Earth. It took place only 7 decades ago in 1908 in Siberia. It was an amazing fall. On the one hand, it did enormous damage, for it fell in a forest and knocked down every tree for scores of miles. As we now know, something along the lines of 80 million trees, old growth, taiga trees, big trees, were knocked down. On the other hand, it did very little damage, for it killed not one human being. Not immediately, anyway. There were several people who may have died in the aftermath. But there was no documented deaths of human beings in the immediate aftermath of the event. So Asimov goes on to say, consider how unusual that had to be. 70% of the Earth's surface is water. If that fall had taken place anywhere in the ocean, tsunamis would have washed the nearer shores and done much damage. Another 10% of the Earth's surface is covered by permanent ice. If the fall had taken place there, enough melting might just barely have come about to cause the slippage of large quantities of ice into the ocean, bringing about catastrophic changes in the Earth's sea level and climate. At least 15% of what is left of the Earth's surface is populated more or less thickly with human beings, and is littered more or less thoroughly with the products of their civilization. If the fall had taken place there, anywhere from hundreds to millions of people would have been killed, and anywhere from thousands to billions of dollars of damage would have been inflicted. The fall would have completely wiped out any city it had struck. Recall the reference to 4 hours and 47 minutes later, it would have wiped out the city of Leningrad. Perhaps not more than 5% of the surface of the Earth could have received that 1908 blow without any damage at all being done to human life and property. And with the odds 20 to 1 against it, that fall took place more or less safely from the human standpoint. By the same token, though, the place in which the fall occurred was inaccessible, else it would have been populated, and it was years before the vicinity could be examined. It was only then that the real mystery began. Consider that the fall managed to find a 1 in 20 place where it would do no damage, almost as if, though, someone was trying humanely to avoid what? There are many unexplained mysteries surrounding the Tunguska cosmic event of June 1908. It is my belief that understanding the lessons this phenomena has to teach us are of the utmost importance to our future survival as a civilization. In this episode of Squaring the Circle, we are going to take a closer look at some of the research that opens a window onto one of the most extraordinary events of the 20th century. The first report we shall examine was written in 1982 by lead authors Richard P. Turco, currently professor at the Institute of the Environment, Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences with the University of California, and Owen B. Toon, professor of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences, currently a fellow at the Laboratory for Atmospheric and Space Physics at the University of Colorado in Boulder. The title of their report was, or is, an analysis of the physical, chemical, optical, and historical impacts of the 1908 Tunguska meteor fall. It was published in the journal Icarus, Volume 50, Number 1, in April of 1982. A detailed analysis of the physical nature and photochemical after effects of the explosive cometary meteor Tunguska is presented. The physical manifestations of the event, such as the acoustic and seismic waves, forest damage, and so on, are shown to be consistent with the entry of a 5 million ton object into the Earth's atmosphere, moving at 40 kilometers per second. The meteor apparently had a very low effective density due either to its intrinsic porous structure, to its shattering in orbit far from the Earth, or to a breakup upon initial impact with the Earth's upper atmosphere. Aerodynamic calculations are used to demonstrate that the shock waves emanating from the falling meteor could have generated up to 30 million tons of nitric oxide in the stratosphere and mesosphere. The report goes on. On the morning of June 30th, 1908, at 7:17 a.m. local time, a huge bolide plunged toward Earth over central Siberia and exploded with tremendous force high in the atmosphere. The brilliant falling meteor was seen for hundreds of kilometers around. The explosion was heard 1,000 kilometers away. That's more than 600 miles. And the pressure disturbances traveled twice around the globe. It is now widely believed that the Tunguska meteor was a small cometary fragment. Theoretical and experimental simulations of the event demonstrate that an object of very low density, flying at hypersonic velocity, can produce the observed ground tremor, acoustic waves, and forest damage. End of quote. Following the Tunguska explosion, anomalous atmospheric emissions brightened the nighttime sky over Europe and Asia on several consecutive evenings. 2 weeks after the event, moreover, sunlight was noticeably dimmed for several weeks over North America. Park, in 1978, suggested that both of these unusual phenomena may have been the result of nitric oxide generated during the meteor fall. In air heated by the shock waves surrounding high-velocity meteors, the temperature can reach tens of thousands of degrees Kelvin, and the N2 and O2 molecules, that is, the nitrogen and oxygen molecules, can be fully disassociated. As the meteor trail expands and cools, most of the N and the O, the nitrogen and oxygen atoms, recombine into N2 and O2, that is, nitrogen molecules and oxygen molecules, but some recombines into nitric oxide. So Park estimated that the amount of nitric oxide generated by the Tunguska meteor may have been several tens of millions of tons, which is certainly enough to have triggered widespread atmospheric disturbances. The report continues. Extraterrestrial bodies possessing intrinsic densities much lower than that of a comet core have not been identified. A comet with a large fraction of volatile material might slowly sublimate on successive passes near the Sun, leaving behind a highly porous matrix. A piece of such a matrix could retain enough cohesion to reach the Earth intact. Comet Encke is a prime candidate as the parent comet for the Tunguska meteor. Note, Comet Encke, because we'll have much more to say about Comet Encke and its associated meteor stream. Although the probability of such low-density objects colliding with the Earth is quite small, the cometary hypothesis is more plausible than the alternative suggestion of a stony meteor. Accordingly, the cometary explanation of the Tunguska event is adopted in the present work. This theory does not conflict with the apparent discovery of meteoritic debris at the fall site. A comet with a mass of several million tons would contain large quantities of metallic and stony materials. Tunguska meteor was probably a fragile cometary fragment, possibly disengaged from Comet Encke, consisting of several million tons of deep frozen ices. If the Tunguska meteor caused massive ozone reductions that persisted for several years, then related disturbances in global weather patterns might have occurred. Now, nitric oxides are known to cause the destruction of ozone, which is O3. You may recall fears about an anthropogenically caused ozone layer, an ozone hole or a hole in the ozone layer. Well, as it turns out, nitric oxides, such as can be generated during an event like the Tunguska impact into the atmosphere, will produce, as we just learned, huge amounts of nitric oxides, which can then have an effect on the amount, causing a decrease in the amount of ozone. Now, you know that ozone acts as a shield that prevents the penetration of ultraviolet radiation from the sun, without which we would be susceptible to all kinds of things, which we'll talk about here in a second, which will be mentioned. Hampson in 1974 first suggested that a full-scale nuclear war might severely deplete the ozone shield, possibly flooding the Earth with ultraviolet radiation and triggering a major climate change. Now, as noted earlier, Tunguska can be roughly equated with a 6,000 megaton nuclear war regarding the nitrogen oxide production. So this is not the same as the amount of energy released in the blast, but the equivalent amount of nitrogen oxide that could be produced by an event like Tunguska could be equivalent to a 6,000 megaton nuclear war. Now, that would be a globally devastating apocalyptic event, right? So now, accordingly, Tunguska may provide a test of the ozone weather coupling hypothesis, of potential climate triggering mechanisms, and of possible biological consequences of prolonged dosages of an enhanced ultraviolet radiation. So, the explosion of the Tunguska object creates the nitric oxides, which now destroy the ozone, which now allows increased amounts of ultraviolet radiation to reach the surface of the Earth. Okay? An enduring stratospheric dust veil created by the Tunguska meteor could also have affected the Earth's radiation balance and possibly the climate. So, to this end, weather records from the early 1900s were surveyed for possible significant climate weather changes in the Tunguska epoch. We found several unusual weather conditions that appeared to commence around 1908 and persist for several years. For example, there was an increase above a decreasing trend in the south to north difference of the mean surface air temperature over North America in the latitude range of 30 to 41 degrees north. Now, that increase in the difference in that gradient also can cause enhanced weather events, storms, cyclones, and so on, because it's that latitudinal gradient that produces, for example, the tornado belt that we've talked about in earlier episodes of Squaring the Circle. Okay, so there was a south to north difference of the mean surface air temperature over North America that showed up both January and July beginning in 1909 and 1910. Total Arctic sea ice increased rapidly between 1908 and 1911. Stratospheric temperature decreases associated with the Tunguska meteor fall were predicted to lie in the range of 1 to 2 degrees Kelvin. These values are consistent with other calculations of temperature effects caused by large stratospheric ozone depletion. Large ozone reductions, such as those calculated for the Tunguska event, can have severe environmental consequences. For example, a 45% ozone depletion can result in almost a tripling of the erythemally active ultraviolet radiation intensity at the ground. Erythemally simply refers to the tendency to sunburn, okay? So it can almost cause so get this, a 45% ozone depletion could cause a tripling of the active ultraviolet radiation intensity of the ground, and hence a tripling of the tendency to sunburn. The possible biological consequences of ultraviolet radiation enhancement are numerous, including a greater frequency of skin cancer in man and the destruction of sensitive plants and microorganisms. If our ozone calculation for Tunguska is correct, the Northern Hemisphere may have received a sustained, intensified ultraviolet radiation dosage from 1908 through 1911. In all, the dosage could have been twice the normal value for that period. Based on a thorough analysis of the atmospheric phenomena associated with the Tunguska meteor fall of 1908, the following conclusions were reached by this scientific team. Now, I'm not going to include all of those conclusions because of space limitations, but only those of special relevance to the theme of this discussion. So, there were records of the acoustic and seismic disturbances and forest destruction caused by the Tunguska meteor explosion, which severely constrained the intrinsic properties of the body. The absence of craters at the fall site suggests total destruction of the meteor within the atmosphere. This in turn implies a low-density cometary body which could be stopped by air friction, or possibly a fragile carbonaceous chondrite meteor which could be pulverized by aerodynamic stresses. Second, the Tunguska meteor, because of its great intrinsic energy, may have generated as much as 30 million tons of nitric oxide in the Earth's stratosphere and mesosphere. This immense NO injection would have caused large ozone depletions over the Northern Hemisphere. Hello, folks. Randall Carlson here. I'd like to take a moment to inform you about the upcoming Extraordinary Technology Conference hosted by Tesla Tech, LLC. The conference will be kicking off this coming August 7th in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and will run for 5 full days. Every year, participants get to see and hear about cutting-edge technologies and ideas presented in a forum devoted to free scientific expression. The conference provides a platform for peer review of the ideas that modern scientific heterodoxy has deemed improbable, if not impossible. Previous presenters have included Marco Rodin, Paul Pantone, Moray King, and Dr. Carolyn McMakin, as well as many others. This year, there will be 28 innovative and forward-thinking speakers who will be educating their audience about an amazing array of topics, including, of course, Tesla technology, but also magnetic motors, energy-saving devices, zero-point energy, water technology, cosmic and radiant energy, Brown's gas, anti-gravity, low-temperature plasma, electrogravitation, electromedicine, terrain theory, and lots of practical do-it-yourself advice. Some of the concepts presented at the conference are available nowhere else, and many of the speakers will have actual working hardware and devices available for demonstration and inspection. Now here's some great news. The entire event will be live streamed by my partners at howtube.com and can be downloaded to your favorite device for watching in perpetuity. So follow the link below to get your live stream tickets and be prepared for a mind-expanding view into a new world of possibilities and potential. And please join me and the growing worldwide community of innovators, inventors, students, and pioneers in alternative technologies and science. Thank you for your time. The light nights, which startled the populace of Eurasia on the evenings of June 30th through July 2nd, 1908, were probably caused principally by sunlight scattered from ice clouds formed at the cold summer mesopause at the level of roughly 80 to 90 kilometers. Also by microscopic rock debris and water vapor ablated from the meteor itself. Data are developed which suggests that a significant climate change may have occurred in the aftermath of the Tunguska meteor explosion. In the decade following 1908, the northern hemisphere cooled by 0.3 degrees Kelvin relative to the southern hemisphere. Despite the difficulties encountered in making a quantitative scientific appraisal of the Tunguska phenomena and its after effects, the great meteor of 1908 apparently caused one of the most extensive and persistent stratospheric disturbances of this century and possibly of the millennium. So now our next report comes from the German astrophysicist Wolfgang Kundt, a close friend of the controversial scientist Thomas Gold. His report appeared in the journal Current Science in the year 2002. The title of the article was, or is, the 1908 Tunguska Catastrophe, an Alternative Explanation. Now, this explanation brings in a whole other dimension to this phenomena. I don't think that it contradicts or is incompatible with the idea of a cometary fragment coming into the atmosphere from space, but it does shed another dimension of possibility to this phenomena. And I will leave that up to the listener to decide for themselves whether or not this is significant. But in upcoming podcasts, we will be discussing similar ideas to what we're going to find in this particular report, which is an alternative explanation to the Tunguska catastrophe. So again, prefacing, quote, on June 30th, 1908, a 7:15 a.m., hell broke loose in the Tunguska area, more than 700 kilometers or 435 miles north-northwest from Lake Baikal. Epicenter at 101 degrees, 53 minutes, 40 seconds east, and 60 degrees, 53 minutes, and 9 seconds north, if you want to go to Google Earth and find the site with high accuracy. So the ground trembled. Baryzl guns were heard firing. Baryzl guns are also called brontides, Brontides, look it up. Whirlwinds or gusts blew, and the sky was torn by columns of fire. Trees were felled in an on-average radial pattern over an area of 2,150 square kilometers, which works out to be about 830 square miles, and scorched in patches over a central area adding up to 1/5 of that size. Hunters and herdsmen, teepees and storage huts, and dozens or even hundreds of reindeer were blown into the air and or incinerated in various places of that area. Even at Vanavara, the nearest trading post at a distance of 60 kilometers from the epicenter, which is about 40 miles, people felt burning heat in their faces and were thrown off their feet. Think about that. 40 miles away from the epicenter of this explosion, people were blown off their feet. Okay? That's a long ways. So, a testimony to the power of this explosion. But the report goes on. The Tunguska epicenter coincides with the middle of the 250 million year old Kulikovsky volcanic crater, which forms part of the Kushminsky tectono-volcanic complex. Now, 250 million years. That was mentioned. 250 million years ago, I will mention, was the largest mass extinction in the history of life on Earth, and it was largely connected with major volcanic eruptions, series of volcanic eruptions that occurred in Siberia, producing what is now known as the Siberian traps. And the point of extrusion for this gigantic basalt plateau happens to be this tectono-volcanic center over which the Tunguska explosion occurred. On June 30th, starting at 6 minutes after the Tunguska explosion, the Irkutsk Observatory measured anomalies of the Earth's magnetic field. Some information is also available from seismograms, barographs, and magnetometers. Several earthquakes are reported during 1908 in the Baikal region, peaking on the 30th of June with a 9-minute ringing at the Irkutsk station. So, in other words, in the days and weeks leading up to the Tunguska explosive event, there were earthquakes in the region showing that there was tectonic activity and seismic activity, and they peaked on the 30th of June. Okay? Barographs show similar signals to those of nuclear explosions. And when you, in part 2 of this episode, I'll show an example of the barograph the effects that passed around the world twice. And in the last episode, we talked about how the timing was quite appropriate or auspicious. Because of the emplacement of these barographs, we were able to detect the pressure pulse from this explosion that passed around the world twice. So the tectono-volcanic complex referred to here is the site of one of the greatest outpourings of basaltic lava in the history of the Earth. The solidification of this enormous mass of lava formed the so-called Siberian traps, which are associated with the most severe mass extinction event in the history of the Earth. The year after the publication of the Wolfgang Kundt paper, a Russian scientist published a paper in the journal Earth, Moon, and Planets. The scientist was physicist and independent researcher Andrei U. Olakovatov. The title of the paper was Geophysical Circumstances of the 1908 Tunguska Event in Siberia, Russia. It appeared in the journal Earth, Moon, and Planets, volume 93, in November. So here is quoting now from that report. From a geological perspective, the Tunguska event occurred in a rather remarkable place in the southern part of the Siberian platform. It was the place of one of the most powerful volcanic episodes in Earth history 250 million years ago, a former hot spot. The region is rich in various gas, oil, and ore deposits, including rare earth elements and platinoids. There are kimberlites in the region, too. For the sake of time, I'm not going to talk about kimberlites. Please look it up, kimberlites with a K, and you'll learn what a kimberlite is. So there are kimberlites in the region, too. The upper mantle in this region has anomalous speeds of seismic waves. The Tunguska epicenter is right in the middle of the ancient volcanic crater, which, after its discovery in 1972, got the name Chelyabinsk. This volcano is part of the Kushminsky tectonovolcanic complex. The Tunguska event occurred in the bundle, that is, the intersection area of several powerful tectonic faults in the region. Interestingly, Eremenko in 1992 writes about one of the most prominent faults, the Berezovsko-Vanovarsky tectonic fault, and that part of it goes right along the trajectory of the Tunguska meteorite. To check for seismic and tectonic activity in the Tunguska event region, we have investigated a catalog of earthquakes. For 1908 and also for previous years, the purpose was to estimate the number of local earthquakes in the Tunguska event region during those years. To select only earthquakes in the Tunguska event region, earthquakes reported just to the north of Lake Baikal, excluding its shore, were taken. The result is the following. In 1906, there occurred just one earthquake that was registered. In 1907, there was 2. In 1908, there were 6, including the one associated with the Tunguska event. I would like to mention that one of our original sponsors at Cosmographia, CBD from the Gods, is following us here to our new podcast, Squaring the Circle. As many of you know, I've been using their products for going on 4 years now, and having tried a number of CBD brands, CBD from the Gods seems the most effective for my needs, which is primarily as a sleep aid and as a remedy for inflammation and associated pain. I use both the oil and the salve. My wife also likes their products, especially the salve, which alleviates the pain in her hands, which is the result of working for years as an electrician. If you've been thinking about trying a CBD product and experiencing the benefits for yourself, give CBD from the Gods a try. To learn more and see their product line, check out cbdfromthegods.com. Any purchase of their products helps our efforts here at Squaring the Circle to realize our goal of making this world a better place. Thanks. And then a year later, in 1909, there was 0. And in 1910, there was 1. In other words, in 1908, an upsurge in seismic activity took place in the area of the Tunguska event. The latter result is in agreement with the data for the whole Baikal Rift and its surrounding seismicity, which shows 10 earthquakes in 1908 and just 1 in 1909 and 1910, and an absence of detected earthquakes in 1911. The distribution of earthquakes in the Baikal Rift region and surroundings within the year 1908 is also remarkable and is shown in Figure 2. The earthquakes cluster around the Tunguska one. In other words, there was a peak of regional seismic activity at about June 30th, 1908. It is important that besides tectonic, there were also numerous other geophysical peculiarities in that period of time on a regional as well as a much larger scale. There were some peculiarities in global atmospheric circulation at about the Tunguska date. In June 1908, a high barometric maximum was lying to the north in the Arctic region, and the winds blowing from the north and cyclones over Siberia in June were much deeper and stronger than usual, which led to significant increase in air pressure gradients. Another peculiarity was the unusually warm or hot weather in Europe, and especially in Siberia in the second half of June. Together with the small number of thunderstorms that led to drought in some regions. However, at the beginning of July, the situation sharply changed. There was a strong increase in thunderstorm activity in Europe, and especially in the western part of Russia and Siberia. Powerful thunderstorms took place. For example, in the Perm province of Russia in July, the quantity of precipitation was a record for the whole 70 previous years of measurements. The northern or Arctic area of high pressure sharply decreased in dimensions. These meteorological peculiarities were particularly prominent in the region of the Tunguska Event. We have discovered that it was a change from good weather to a bad weather right on June 30th, 1908, especially in the morning. So in the second graphic here, it shows a time sequence of earthquakes in the Lake Baikal region from March 1908 to November 1908. As you'll see, the enlarged vertical line represents seismic manifestations associated with the Tunguska event. So the number of earthquake reports globally per day for 1 week before and after the Tunguska event. In the second graphic, the 0 on that graphic, that represents June 30th. So from catalogs, the regional catalog of earthquakes 1908, published in 1917 by A. Seeberg in French, is where we find the source of that particular data included in that graph. So then we have research conducted in 1984, statistical analysis of witnesses' accounts has revealed that Tunguska event was accompanied by various meteorological phenomena, including strong wind, windstorms, haze, fog, temperature changes, thunderstorms, whirlwinds. In other words, the Tunguska event indeed took place during a period of strong meteorological peculiarity associated with sharp weather worsening. Other geophysical anomalies surrounding the Tunguska event reported by Ola Kovatov include the following. On June 29th, a peculiar glow was observed in the Austrian Alps called Alps glow. It was reported in Vasiliev et al. And others, that is, in 1965, in an article entitled Night Glowing Clouds and Optical Anomalies Associated with the Fall of the Tunguska Meteorite. It was originally published in Russian. The famous explorer Sir Douglas Mawson from Australia, also a geologist, was on at the time an expedition to Antarctica. He observed an exceptional sky glow, as he called it, 7 hours before the Tunguska event in Europe. Now, how do you explain that? Before, you would think, well, then there would have been no connection and no association until you understand the way the comets function in the solar wind. And that is that the pressure of the solar wind causes the dust trail and the ion tail to point away from the sun, right? So, and we learned from the eyewitness accounts that the direction from which, the radiant point from which this object emanated was coming directly from the area of the sky where the sun was. So that means that the tail and the dust trail and the ion tail would have been preceding the object, okay? That might explain how Mawson in Antarctica was able to see these tremendous glowing skies 7 hours before the actual object entered the atmosphere and exploded. There was a report that appeared in the science journal Nature on July 4th of 1908, and this is how it read. The peculiar light phenomenon at midnight on June 30th, which was seen, according to the papers, on the northern part of the sky at Copenhagen, Königsberg, Berlin, Vienna, Biala, and other places, was also observed by me at Prague. This was an eyewitness account that was being reported in the journal. At 1 hour 30 minutes a.m. on July 1st, I saw in the direction northeast and north-northeast a peculiar orange-yellow light over the horizon, the color of which was more orange in its lower parts and more yellow in its higher parts. Other people saw it here at 11 p.m. on June 30th. It is also reported that there were magnetic disturbances experienced on the telegraph lines. I may be allowed to add that, according to Arrhenius, this time of the year corresponds to the minimal auroral display. Interesting is the fact that a high barometric maximum was lying to the north and that we had winds from that direction for a whole week. So this was Borislav Brauner with the Bohemian University in Prague. There was another report that appeared in the same issue of Nature for July of 1908 regarding phenomena witnessed on June 30th. Here's what the report read, the eyewitness report. Quote, "There has been a visible here today a solar halo remarkable for its vivid intensity and for its protracted duration. It was first noticed by me at 12:35 p.m. It then formed an unbroken ring of which the most intensely luminous portion was to the south of the sun and the least luminous portion to the west-northwest. Half an hour later, the southern and northern quadrants of the circle were equally bright. These conditions remained unchanged for fully 1.5 hours. The unusually strong tone of rusty orange coloring and the conspicuous darkness of the region enclosed made the halo an unusually striking object when at its best. Throughout the day, cirrus clouds were strewn about the sky in the most interesting disorder and variety of forms. Telegraphic observation of the sun's image shows that in features of atmospheric distortion of the sun's limb and upper of great velocity passing from the south and southeast. So there was anomalies seen in the sun and then in the air movements of the atmosphere. So how do we explain all this? I don't know. But let's consider, while numerous other accounts could be included, I think we've heard enough here to ask whether it is possible that all these peculiarities were somehow related, were all part of the Tunguska cosmic event. If the answer is no, then they're merely coincidental. But then I think we have to decide, what do we actually mean when we dismiss occurrences outside the norm as coincidental? And if they're not coincidental, then we must accept the fact that there are forces in nature whose operations we really do not yet understand. So the controversy comes down to this. Was the Tunguska event celestial or terrestrial in origin? I would argue that the answer is inclusive. It was both. I will conclude this part of episode 13 by quoting from a reviewer's synopsis of the 1994 book Craters, Cosmos, and Chronicles by the late Herbert R. Shaw, a distinguished scientist emeritus with the U.S. Geological Survey. I believe that the significance of Shaw's work has yet to be fully appreciated. The review, from which I'm going to quote, was penned by Alan R. Huffman and appeared in the journal EOS in July of 1996. And I quote from his review, "The notion that the Earth might be influenced significantly by external forces has always been a rather disquieting concept for geoscientists who are trained to think in terms of uniformitarianism. The mass extinction debates of the last 15 years and the strong disagreement among advocates of impact and terrestrial extinction mechanisms are classic examples of this issue. A new book by Herbert R. Shaw makes the case that the evolution of the Earth and other planets has been significantly affected by extraterrestrial processes throughout their histories, and these processes are part of a universal system of coupled, nonlinear oscillators. Shaw argues that clustered bombardment by extraterrestrial objects along swaths that are constant over specific time periods has been a major force for change acting in concert with planetary geodynamic forces. I'll repeat that again. Has been a major force for change acting in concert with planetary geodynamic forces to shape the face of our world and the other planets in the solar system. In conclusion, I'll say this. A lot of fascinating ideas have been presented in this episode of Squaring the Circle and the preceding parts 1 and 2 of The Cosmos Speaks. We may be on the threshold of a new integrated understanding of the cosmic ecosystem of which our world is a part, and the matrix of space, time, and energy in which the miracle of existence is unfolding. So thank you for joining me in this Gnostic journey that will continue. I will see you in the next episode of Squaring the Circle. Hello, welcome back to this episode of Squaring the Circle. We're going to continue discussing the amazing event that occurred on June 30th, 2008, 1908, and learn more about it because there's many lessons to be extracted from this event. We, of course, are not going to cover everything, but we're going to give enough indication as to some of the unsolved mysteries and areas of research that are currently underway and where it may be leading us to. So we are just going to begin here by going back into the program. We'll be looking at some graphics and some interesting quotes here, and then we'll be setting up for the next episode of Squaring the Circle. Okay, so let's get right into it. We will go to our PowerPoint show, and I'm calling this Cosmic Forewarning because that is exactly what it was. This was a forewarning about what could be pending in our future at some point, something that has occurred. We're learning quite frequently in the past, and we're going to be delving into that and how it may have affected history in upcoming episodes of Squaring the Circle. But let's just get going here. So we'll review a couple of quotes, important quotes that we've already dealt upon just to get some connectivity here with what's gone down before. So as we see here from Kevin Zonley, Leaving No Stone Unburned, which appeared in the science journal Nature back in 1996. He says, perhaps the earliest widely held theory for the Tunguska explosion was that the world was about to end. And I have this as the first quote because we're going to see how the events and the eyewitness accounts, which we already covered in the previous episode of Squaring the Circle, will give us insight into traditional accounts, legendary accounts, eschatological and apocalyptic accounts that we've inherited from the ancient world. And by looking at these events through the lens of the Tunguska event, we may be able to understand them in a different light. So as Zonley goes on to say, the Tunguska impactor exploded above a sparsely inhabited region in central Siberia with the force of a 15 megaton bomb. The blast wave flattened trees over 2,000 square kilometers. I think that's been refined to about 2,150 square kilometers, and it excited a magnitude 5 earthquake. Thermal radiation scorched trees and set fires over much of the range, and even 70 kilometers away, an observer removed his shirt for fear it would ignite. So 70 kilometers away, if I pull up my calculator right here, and I put in, what was it, 70 kilometers, and I go times 0.62, that's about 44 miles. Okay, so about 44 miles away, there was a gentleman, not only thought his shirt was going to catch fire, but he was knocked off his feet by the shock wave. Now, that's 44 miles, so think about that. Next time you're out, you're driving cross country, or you're going on a little tour or whatever, think about 44 miles and realize that 44 miles away from the epicenter of this explosion, people were blown off their feet, okay? So then we're going to jump back to 1931, J.G. Crowther. This was published in Scientific American. One of the very early accounts that appeared in English as far as the reportage on the Tunguska event. He says, this is more about the Great Siberian Meteor. Many other reports referred to the devastation of the forest and the felling of the trees in uniform directions, one to the destruction of several Tungus families and one to a forest fire. The Tungus' terror of the district will be understood when I report that Professor Kulik told me the occurrence had caused the evolution of a new tribal religion. They regarded the arrival of the meteorite as a visitation from a god named Agni, meaning fire, to punish the wicked. The place is believed to be accursed. Now, again, I put this quote in here because what we see is that there was a response, an emotional and psychological response to the people who experienced and witnessed this event, and it was interpreted in terms of a religious type of experience. In this case, of a god descending from heaven to punish the wicked, and it launched a new religion amongst these people. So, to me, this is a really important insight, one of the consequences of this event and how it affected people. And knowing this, again, this is part of the lens through which we're going to look at some of the ancient traditions and prophecies and so on. And I think this is why I'm calling this The Cosmos Speaks. The Cosmos Speaks, and it's going to teach us about some of these events that will give us insight into some of our own traditions that we've inherited from the past. All right, let's look at a few maps here to help get the big picture here. All right, so here's Siberia. This is actually the Eurasian plate. And notice Lake Baikal. And for those of you that are really wanting to get deeper into this, I'm going to highly recommend going into Google Earth, Google Maps, go to Terrain View and Google Maps so that you can get the digital elevations in there. Go to Google Earth. You can then scroll around. You can look at it in 2D. You can look at it in 3D. And anyways, you can see here where the blast occurs, just kind of to the north, almost just to the north of Lake Baikal, which is in a rift zone. It happens to be the deepest lake on the planet, and it's in a major rift zone. And there's some very interesting things we could talk about Lake Baikal, but I'm not going to get into that in this particular episode. But it seems like there is a continuity of geophysical phenomena from Lake Baikal up encompassing the location of the Tunguska blast. And we're going to be talking about that in a minute. So let's keep going here with some more maps to help give you perspective. Now, this one is just a very simplified stripped down map where you can kind of see some of the surrounding settlements. The closest one, Vanavara, which was about 40 miles from the blast zone, was kind of the jumping off point. This is where Kulik made his way to and then was able to procure guides there and then proceed north to the location of the explosion and the tree fall. The other communities from which many eyewitness accounts have been preserved are Kezhma, Kamenka, Ilimsk, Kerensk, Krasnoyorsk, And from those accounts, which I delved into quite a bit in the previous episodes, you can get a pretty good idea of how people responded to this and their own experiences, their firsthand experiences. Let's go to another map. And these are points of view from which different eyewitness accounts were collected. For example, there were eyewitness accounts collected from Keshma, right? Down here from Minusинsk, Alexandrovka, etc. So they have been compiled here. So there was a lot of, the length of this indicates that there were a lot of eyewitness accounts that were collected at this particular place, Alexandrovka. Okay. Excuse me that I don't speak fluent Russian. Okay. But anyways, from collecting these eyewitness accounts, and you can see, so somebody here in Mironovo looked to the northwest to see the region of the blast. Somebody down here in this location looked to the northeast. So by taking the positions of the various eyewitness accounts, it was possible to sort of calculate a trajectory of the incoming bolide, okay, from which direction it came. And here's kind of a stripped down map from, I believe this is from Google Maps, and you can see here the blast event was here at the point of this balloon here, Vanavera here, Keshma, Krinsk, Kamenka, etc. You'll see Lake Baikal down here. So again, I would encourage you to go ahead and do a little of your own research if this kind of thing interests you. Who knows, you may make some interesting discoveries. So we've seen the photo here of Leonid Kulik, who was the first scientist to reach the region of the Tunguska catastrophe. And I've maintained that the heroic efforts to reach the blast site would make a really quite epic movie, because these were truly intrepid scientists who had to slog their way through quicksand and through marsh and thick forests and deal with the elements, the extreme cold, in order to get to the blast site. And it's quite an epic tale. Let's go to the next one here. You can see that they're crossing the Taiga. Kulik's intrepid team is dragging boats across the rapids of the river Kushmo to reach the site of the great explosion. Notice that they've got these headgear on, and that's because the mosquitoes, these giant vicious mosquitoes, were very prolific in the area. So that was just one of the many things they had to contend with. They had to deal with rapids. They had to deal with illness. They had to deal with, on several occasions, almost being killed. So yeah, there's a whole story here that's quite amazing. And of course, the end result of that was that they arrived at the location. And then we'll look at where Kulik recorded his psychological and emotional response to seeing this area. Now, his first attempt there failed because just as they're entering the blast zone and they saw the extent of the destruction that reached as far as the eye could see, the Tungusi guides that they had hired from Vanavera totally freaked out. They panicked, they couldn't deal with it, and they fled. So they had to go back to Vanavera and procure different guides. So let's go on here. This is the famous photograph that shows the trees blasted down. Now, but remember, this is covering over 2,100 square miles of this old growth taiga forest, just completely mowed over, like it was hay, being cut down by a rake. I mean, by a just by a mower, right? This is, as it says here, 5 miles from ground zero, 20 years after the blast. And you can also see that there are some vertical trees here that didn't get knocked down, but they've been completely stripped of branches, in a lot of cases even stripped of bark. And this is because you had both a vertical component and a horizontal component to the pressure wave that came down. Now remember, this is not an impact into the ground. It's an aerial burst. And this is a very important feature of this phenomena to keep in mind. This is an aerial burst, so it's not creating a deep hole in the ground, a crater that can now be studied by scientists, decades or millennia afterwards, right? This is very important. This is an important thing to keep in mind when we start talking about cosmic impacts and understanding that there may be a far more aerial bursts, such as Tunguska, than previously appreciated. So the next slide is going to give us a quote from the diary of Leonid Kulik upon his reaction to beholding the destruction, the massive forest destruction, as far as the eye could see. He says, "I still cannot sort out my chaotic impressions of this excursion. From our observation point, no sign of forest can be seen, for everything has been devastated and burned. One has an uncanny feeling when one sees 20 and 30-inch thick giant trees snapped across like twigs and their tops hurled many meters away. The results of even a cursory examination exceeded all the tales of the eyewitnesses and my wildest expectations." Now, there was some shallow crater-like features found in the vicinity of the blast, which Kulik erroneously believed were craters formed by impact of material from the object, the meteorite. He believed it was a meteorite. And you can see here, this is called the Suslov hole, who was one of his colleagues, named after one of his colleagues. This was in May of 1929, after being drained by Kulik and his team. Now, at some point, I'm going to talk with somebody about the connection with the Carolina Bays, because there seems to be some similarity. I was trying to think of Chris Cottrell. I want to talk to Chris Cottrell. He's probably seen this, but I initially did a lot of research into the Carolina Bays back in the late 80s, early 90s. I even hired a pilot to fly me over some of the Carolina Bays in South Georgia back in the early 90s. Chris Cottrell has sort of picked up the baton. He's gone further into that research than I have. But you can see here again, this was in The Fire Came by Gallant, which is a book that I will be posting a link to so you can get it. This is one of the small, as it said, neat oval bogs that Kulik erroneously presumed to be secondary craters of the fragmented meteorite. This one was named after the ethnographer Suslov. So again, it's a shallow, elliptical, or oval, kind of a swamp-like feature. This next slide, which is pretty grainy, but you can still get the sense that there are multiple of these crater swamps, as they were called, found in the area beneath the epicenter of the blast. Now, what produced these? Why are they oval? Well, if they were pressure waves intersecting the ground, then they're probably at an angle. If you take a cone and slice it at an angle, you're going to get an oval or an ellipse, okay? And here's the so-called South Swamp. This was ground zero. Here's another image of it, and you can see trees stripped around here. Now, interesting about this, you see that the vertical trees haven't been blown over because essentially this is directly below the explosion, so the blast wave was directed straight down, almost. And then in an area of about a couple of 100 square kilometers, everything was incinerated. And then around that, you had trees that were still vertical. And then outside that ring, you had trees that had been knocked over. And I found this online years ago. I have not been able to find it since to give the attribution to the origin. I hope whoever took this photo doesn't mind that we look at it. if you contact me, of course, we'll be more than happy to give you attribution. But here again, you see a more recent photograph of one of the oval bogs. Now, for some of you who are doing more in-depth research and are familiar with Chris Cottrell's work, you might go there and see what his latest insights are into this phenomena here. Okay, so here is the area of forest devastation inside the butterfly, approximately 800 square miles or 2,150 square kilometers. Here you see the rim of the devastation. Everything within this rim that you see here was pretty much completely devastated. So you had, within that rim, you had the radial pattern of felled trees, and you can see, you see the Vanavera trading post down here. So this was the closest village, and yeah, so you can see it gives you Kulik's route here up to through the area of devastation. And it gives us this guide to, and I'll have links that you'll be able to go if you want to do more research, more in-depth research. Now, what I've done in the next couple of slides is I've taken the blast zone of what I would call total devastation, which is where all of the trees were felled and knocked over, which shows enormous pressures, atmospheric pressures. And I've juxtaposed that. Since I live near Atlanta, Georgia, I juxtaposed this on the city of Atlanta. Now, if any of you have ever been to Atlanta, you know it's a very big, sprawling city, covers as much area, probably close to the amount of area as, say, Houston, Texas. Like many of the American cities, it has a perimeter interstate. In this case, it's 285, right? Now, here's what's interesting. I've carefully calculated the area inside 285, and it is roughly a little bit less than 800 square miles. So when we juxtapose the blast zone of Tunguska on top here, you can see how extraordinary this event really was in terms of the area of destruction. And this could apply to pretty much to any urban area on Earth. Okay. The perimeter highway around Washington, D.C. is of a similar scale. So if you had this event, which has been likened to the energy of a roughly 15 megaton hydrogen bomb, you would have millions of casualties here. So you can get the idea here. All right. So from 1966, this was a study of the Tunguska meteor fall. This was published in Soviet Astronomy. And I think you can get this online. I'm not sure. But anyway, from comparisons, this is what they say here. And this is a very interesting and important insight. From comparisons of all the events associated with the catastrophe, it subsequently became clear that the most probable explanation for it was a collision between the Earth and a small comet, whose dust tail, pointing in a direction roughly opposite to the sun, penetrated the upper layers of the Earth's atmosphere and induced an anomalous twilight glow in the sky on that very night, which was July 1st, 1908. Now, we're going to be getting into discussing in more detail comets, but for now, the ion tail and the dust tail, if it's really, really fine dust, the solar wind actually blows it out away from the sun, okay? So if you look at a comet, and I'll be showing you pictures of this in upcoming episodes of Squaring the Circle, if you look at a comet in relation to the sun, you'll always see that the tail of the comet points away from the sun. Okay, this is an important thing to keep in your mind, right? So we normally would think of some object flying through space if there's material coming off of it, it's going to leave a trail behind it. Just like imagine that you've got a dump truck barreling down the highway and dust and rocks and things are spilling out. It's in a trail behind it, right? Well, it's not the same with a comet. You don't look at a comet and see its tail going out and think that that tail is trailing behind the comet. No, the trail or tail, they're different. The trail is the very, very fine dust material. The tail is the ion tail, which is made of plasma. But they're going to be pointing away from the sun. Okay? Picture that. And like I said, in upcoming episodes of Squaring the Circle, you'll get that clear, that impression. Okay, so if you've got this object is coming towards the Earth from the sun, right, from the direction of the sun, that means that the tail is going to be ahead of it. The tail is going to be leading, not following. So the tail, which could be extremely long, hundreds of thousands of miles, perhaps, maybe more, is going to possibly intersect the Earth first before the actual nucleus arrives. Randall Carlson here. I'd like to take a moment to inform you about the upcoming Extraordinary Technology Conference hosted by Tesla Tech LLC. The conference will be kicking off this coming August 7th in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and will run for 5 full days. Every year, participants get to see and hear about cutting-edge technologies and ideas presented in a forum devoted to free scientific expression. The conference provides a platform for peer review of the ideas that modern scientific heterodoxy has deemed improbable, if not impossible. Previous presenters have included Marco Rodin, Paul Pantone, Moray King, and Dr. Carolyn McMakin, as well as many others. This year, there will be 28 innovative and forward-thinking speakers who will be educating their audience about an amazing array of topics, including, of course, Tesla technology, but also magnetic motors, energy-saving devices, zero-point energy, water technology, cosmic and radiant energy, Brown's gas, anti-gravity, low-temperature plasma, electrogravitation, electromedicine, terrain theory, and lots of practical do-it-yourself advice. Some of the concepts presented at the conference are available nowhere else, and many of the speakers will have actual working hardware and devices available for demonstration and inspection. Now here's some great news. The entire event will be live streamed by my partners at howtube.com and can be downloaded to your favorite device for watching in perpetuity. So follow the link below to get your live stream tickets and be prepared for a mind-expanding view into a new world of possibilities and potential. And please join me and the growing worldwide community of innovators, inventors, students, and pioneers in alternative technologies and science. Thank you for your time. So let's go through some of the observed characteristics of the Tunguska event. Now, these are the variations on what people reported in the eyewitness accounts, okay? So, 1, a ball of fire that was brighter than the sun. Now, of course, that suggests pretty close proximity to the blast zone. If you're far, far away from it, like 100 miles, 150, it's probably not going to appear brighter than the sun unless you're looking directly at it. But to the individuals, say within 40, 50, 60 miles, it appeared to be a ball of fire brighter than the sun. As it was flying through the sky, it looked to be multicolored, often, as it says, rainbow streamers forming a tail. Many people described the effect, the impression that the sky opened up. That the sky opened up and then fire poured out of that opening, okay? Or a variation on that was that the sky split in two. Also, there was deafening thunder. I mean, there were actually cases of people, the thunder was so extreme that there are cases of some of the witnesses going deaf going deaf from the intensity of the thunder. And then, as a corollary of that, extremely loud crashes and bangs, etc. The other thing that is very, very interesting of all this is that there was subterranean trembling and shaking, like locomotives passing below. Okay? This was reported frequently by people. We're going to get back into that idea and explore that more because it's, I think, very important. There was a sense of heavy beams or stones striking the ground. Ground and building shaking. As we know now, there was at least a 5.0, maybe somewhat greater earthquake in the region that was apparently caused by the extreme pressure of this explosion intersecting the terrain. Okay? But this sense of heavy beams or stones striking the ground, in some of the eyewitness accounts, you may remember, if you go back and review, people were running, covering their heads because they thought the stones were going to perhaps hit them in the head. Then, of course, there was the intense pressure and blast wave. There was an extreme heat pulse. And people also saw what they described as a pillar of fire or a pillar of smoke. Now, these were the direct experiences and impressions of people who witnessed for themselves the event. Then there was a series of phenomena that came in the aftermath. Okay, let's go through those, because this is some of the stuff we're going to be exploring a little more in depth. Okay, there were, in the secondary effects, there were anomalous optical and atmospheric effects described as white nights or light nights, sky glows, noctilucent clouds, etc. There were intense and prolonged solar halos. And then there were subsequent intense precipitation events over Europe. A decrease in atmospheric transparency detected in the United States. There were disturbances in the points of neutral polarization in scattering of sunlight, which is related to turbulence in the atmosphere. This was detected and recorded in California. So on the other side of the world, there was atmospheric turbulence strong enough to be measured and recorded, right? So this very much implies that the effects of this were on some level or another felt in many places around the world in various ways. There were magnetic microspherules deposited in regional soils. There was an enhancement of carbon-13 and iridium in peat layers that were associated with the catastrophe. Now, iridium, you remember, some of you may recall that iridium was the platinum group metal that was found in association with the Cretaceous Tertiary dinosaur killer of 66 million years ago, right? Now we've got an iridium spike that's showing up and has been discovered in peat that was associated with the catastrophe. Also, there was an extremely rapid recovery of the forest after the catastrophe. Now, I mean, we saw graphics of 20 years later. However, what has happened now is that virtually all, except for the epicenter, the forest, just like what we see if we visit Mount St. Helens, the forests are rapidly regrowing, and the result of that will be that, another century, unless we already knew that the event happened, we could overlook it and not know that this had ever happened. Because unlike an impact, a bolide impact into the ground that creates the classic crater, the bowl, the hole in the ground, that doesn't happen here. It creates surface damage. It can cause earthquakes. Now imagine if Tunguska had been somewhat bigger. The earthquake might have been, who knows, 6 or 7 on the Richter scale. And we're going to be looking at some of the objects that in the last few decades, in the upcoming Squaring the Circle podcast, we're going to be looking at some of the objects that have flown by Earth near-Earth objects that have flown by, many of them which are many times bigger than Tunguska, okay? This is really important. And for the most part, most of humanity, most scientists, other than those astronomers or planetary geologists who are specifically focused on this subject, are not giving it the attention I believe that it really needs. Going on here, we can see that there was an accelerated growth of trees. So there was, and then, which is leading us to some interesting possibilities here. Sharp increase in genetic mutations of plants, possibly animals, in the catastrophe area. And with the warming of the Cold War in the early 90s, you know, Western countries, US, England, France, we all began to get access to a lot of research and data and studies from the former Soviet Union that had explored into areas that, say, American scientists hadn't yet even begun to probe into yet. It's just too bad now that we've decided, some of our politicians have decided that we've got to make an enemy out of Russia, and therefore now we can't have the cultural and scientific exchange that is so fruitful and so beneficial to learning more about our world. So that is really one of the downsides of our politics and our foreign policy now that I personally really find objectionable, is because a lot of good work was coming out of Russia, and that has now become much more difficult to access for us. So anyways, the white nights, the light nights where people were reading all night, here's this map will show locations where these anomalously bright nights were reported following the Tunguska event of June 30th. Now, if the thing is coming in, let's say from, it happened over here to the east of Europe, right? If the material of the tail or the trail now moves over Europe, we'll talk more about this, but one of the things that we see is that following the Tunguska explosion, there were these anomalous atmospheric emissions that brightened the nighttime sky over Europe and Asia on several consecutive evenings. 2 weeks after the event, sunlight was noticeably dimmed for several weeks over North America. Okay? One researcher by the name of Park suggested in 1978 that both of these unusual phenomena may have been the result of nitric oxide that was generated during the meteor fall. We talked about this a little bit in the previous episode. Generated and in air heated by the shock waves surrounding high-velocity meteor. The temperature can reach tens of thousands of degrees Kelvin, and the N2 and the O2 molecules can be fully disassociated. So then as the meteor trail expands and cools, most of the nitrogen and oxygen atoms can recombine into N2 and O2, but some will recombine into nitric oxide. So it could be these anomalies within the atmosphere that caused it to be so bright all night that literally people, now this is in 1908, so they obviously don't have the electric lighting or even gas lighting in most of these places, but people could see almost as bright as day. So this was one of the very interesting secondary consequences of the Tunguska event. These are microbarograms you see from 6 English meteorological stations on the morning of June 30th, 1908. And picture here, the wave is coming in, it's passing over the meteorological station where these barographs are operational, and you can see right here, boom, that wave is passing over and then it vibrates out. You can see here at London, that shows up at Cambridge, Westminster, Leighton, Petersfield. All of these barographs show this pressure wave that literally passed around the world twice, right? That was created by this tremendous explosion in the atmosphere. Then this next one here is graphs. These are atmospheric transmissions measured at different wavelengths. The different wavelengths are coming down here. You can see 40 microns all the way down to 160 microns. So each of these is looking at atmospheric transmission in different wavelengths of the atmosphere, measured at the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory by researchers at Mount Wilson, California. So this was monitoring period that lasted from 1908 to 1911. And what you can see right here is here's between June and July, right? And you see this dashed line is June 30th. This is the Tunguska event right here. And then right after that, look at this dip that you see in virtually every one of these, certainly in these lower wavelengths that you see here. You see this massive dip right in here. That is an indication that atmospheric transmissibility has declined considerably. And basically what that does is it creates a shroud of semi-darkness, if you want to. Now notice over here on the other side, about mid-June, you also see a drop in atmospheric transmission. Okay, so what is this? Well, this was from a volcanic eruption that occurred several weeks before the Tunguska event. Okay, so you got a volcanic eruption here, and then you've got the Tunguska explosion here. Okay, we're going to probably leave it at this point for now, but this is where we get into another realm where we are sort of beginning to look at the fusion between astrophysics and geophysics. So this is Andrei U. Olkhovatov, who published a paper in Russia, 2003, The Tectonic Interpretation of the 1908 Tunguska Event. We addressed this briefly in the first part of this episode. And he says, from the geological aspect, the Tunguska event occurred in a rather remarkable place in the southern part of the Siberian platform. So what's so remarkable about it? Well, it was the place of some of the most powerful volcanic activity in Earth's history 250 million years ago, a former hotspot. The area is rich in various gas, oil, and ore deposits, including rare earth elements and platinoids, meaning platinum group metals. There are kimberlites in the region too, and we'll talk about kimberlites a little bit later on to explain what they are. They're very interesting geological phenomena. It's where a lot of the diamonds are formed, because clearly diamonds form under tremendous pressure, and that's one of the unique characteristics of kimberlites. So there are kimberlites in the region too. The upper mantle in this region has anomalous speeds of seismic waves. The Tunguska epicenter is right in the middle of the paleovolcano crater. So I've repeated this again just because I think it's very important to be aware of this. And when we go on, we're going to address this, that there's direct evidence of ancient shock metamorphism at the site of the 1908 Tunguska event. Now, what is shock metamorphism? Well, as it says here, we'll go into it a little bit and then we'll wrap it up. Shock metamorphism is rarely found at the surface of the Earth. The most used structures to identify shock metamorphism are true planar deformation features. Planar deformation features in quartz, which is now accepted as a diagnostic indicator of a meteorite impact, because obviously an impact into the ground causes tremendously powerful shock waves to move through the bedrock, and certain kinds of rock that contain a lot of quartz, there will be a very unique imprint into these rocks, and we'll look at that in probably in the next episode, because this is, like I said, one of the critical diagnostics for meteorite impact. Now, what this is saying, though, is that there was evidence of shock metamorphism found at the Tunguska site. Well, the Tunguska site didn't impact the ground. There wasn't, the 5+ crater, earthquake that occurred wouldn't have been strong enough pressure to create shock metamorphism in quartz. So this is not from the Tunguska event itself, unless somehow in the explosion itself. Yet, as it turns out, the shocked stuff is found in layers below the surface, so it would suggest that it was the result of a previous impact event. So he says here we present several lines of evidence for shock metamorphism and PDFs developed in quartz occurring on samples centered on a geological structure on Mount Stajkovic, gives the and if you want to take these down and look on Google Earth, you can go right to this site, see it for yourself, and this lies within the southern surface exposures of the Siberian traps. I would like to mention that one of our original sponsors at Cosmographia, CBD from the Gods, is following us here to our new podcast, Squaring the Circle. As many of you know, I've been using their products for going on 4 years now, and having tried a number of CBD brands, CBD from the Gods seems the most effective for my needs, which is primarily as a sleep aid and as a remedy for inflammation and associated pain. I use both the oil and the salve. My wife also likes their products, especially the salve, which alleviates the pain in her hands, which is the result of working for years as an electrician. If you've been thinking about trying a CBD product and experiencing the benefits for yourself, give CBD from the Gods a try. To learn more and see their product line, check out cbdfromthegods.com. Any purchase of their products helps our efforts here at Squaring the Circle to realize our goal of making this world a better place. Thanks. Now, this opens up a very interesting can of worms here, because what it's appearing like is that if there is some kind of shock metamorphism associated with that zone, which we just learned right from this previous, that the Tunguska epicenter is right in the middle of a paleovolcanic volcano crater. So what would be the connection then between shock metamorphism, which suggests an ancient impact, the paleovolcanic crater, and the atmospheric explosion of the Tunguska cosmic object? So these are things we're going to explore in the next episode so that we can get a deeper understanding of the lessons that this particular event has to teach us. So we'll leave it there for now. But there's a lot more to unpack from this thing because, like I said, cosmic lessons, June 30th, 1908, the Tunguska event has profound cosmic lessons to teach us. And once we've got a deeper understanding of this event and its associated phenomena, I think we're going to be able to go back and look at some ancient traditions with a new perspective, and that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be looking at that. Then we're going to be projecting into the future, and we're going to be looking at some of the very frequent events that have been occurring in the last couple of decades with near misses of objects roughly the size of Tunguska and also much, much larger. So we're going to leave it there. I appreciate you joining me for this investigation into some of the mysteries of our past, and I hope you come back for the next episode. We've got a lot of interesting material in the pipeline that we're going to be delving into, and so I'm going to sign out now, and hopefully I will see you for the next episode of Squaring the Circle. Over and out. Hello, Randall Carlson here with a short announcement about the multiple ways you can enjoy my new podcast, Squaring the Circle. If you haven't already done so, please make sure you watch Episode 1 to get a clear and detailed explanation on what you can expect from the Squaring the Circle podcast. All indications are that it promises to be quite a ride. In my effort to make this information available to as many people as possible, I am providing the following options. Full video episodes with ads will run exclusively on Rumble for free, and free audio versions with ads will be distributed to all major podcast platforms worldwide: iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, Google Play, and the rest. Ad-free episodes will air exclusively on my HowTube channel in exchange for a small fee of $7.20 per month. You'll get every episode of Squaring the Circle with no ads, Plus, you'll get exclusive access to bonus material available only to HowTube subscribers, which includes private live streams with question and answer sessions and special presentations on a wide-ranging variety of compelling, relevant, controversial, and interesting topics chosen by myself to challenge your thinking and possibly even inspire you. I will also feature special guests who are making major contributions to the evolution of human civilization and consciousness while advancing the critically important paradigm shift now gaining momentum around the world. In general, we'll be publishing 2 episodes of the podcast per week, and we'll also post 15 to 20-minute clips of each episode daily across our social media channels, for free, of course. We hope you'll follow us there as well. To all of my fellow seekers of knowledge, thank you for joining me on this amazing journey, and I'll be looking forward to seeing you again soon.